My name is Chris Cull. I'm a two-time cross Canada Cyclist, filmmaker, creator of Surviving Addiction, and in recovery from an 8.5-year addiction to opioids. So I grew up in a small town called Beaumont, Ontario, small at the time. My parents split up when I was around 4 years old, and grew up, have an older brother, and my mother moved to the U.S. when I was roughly around 11 years old. And my dad raised me for the most part, but beyond that, I mean, I grew up a fairly, I guess, normal kid, for lack of a better wording, playing hockey, baseball, skateboarding, snowboarding, and had a decent childhood in that sense. And yeah, but through my teenage years I was kind of struggling to understand kind of some specific aspects within my childhood, and particularly with my parents. And yeah, it was a struggle through my teenage years, but for the most part, it was pretty good. I don't, yeah, could have been much worse anyways. My first interaction with substances was, I believe, in grade 6, if I'm not mistaken, when a friend of mine stole a pack of cigarettes from his mom's carton, and then we went behind the portable at my elementary school at like well after school hours, and yeah, and I tried smoking a cigarette for my first time, but I mean, I grew up around smoking. Like, my dad was a smoker. For the better, he quit for a time there, but watching him do it really made me curious about why he did it and what it was like to smoke. So that was my first interaction with substances. As far as like getting into later on, I believe I had my first beer around grade 10. I wasn't a weed smoker until probably I started that in about grade 11. And then after I did that, and kind of growing up, when the tactic is try to scare you into staying on the straight and narrow, where once I kind of smoked weed for the first time, and I'm like, this isn't what you told me it was. That kind of made me curious about what everything else was like to some degree. So, which then kind of spiraled out of control. So initially on that first in high school, it was more of the social component of it. You go to a party, and I don't know how everyone in there got alcohol, but we all managed to. And I remember I stole like 2 or 3 beers from my dad. My dad made his own beer at the time, so and he quickly noticed those bottles were missing. But yeah, no, it was through high school. It was more of a social thing, and then as it progressed, in my late teens, my dad was a paramedic for 27 years, and he was my hero. And when I was in my late teens, he had Huntington's disease. And for any of you not familiar with it, it's a neurodegenerative disease. And he lost his job. He lost his driver's license, lost his will to live. And through that, I started to be, at a fairly young age, become his caregiver. And watching him spiral was hard. And through that, he started trying to take his own life on a fairly consistent basis. And so leading up to his passing, the 2 years leading up to his passing, he tried on a number of times to take his own life. And I would come home. I remember I was a student at Durham College at the time, and I remember coming home from school one day, and I heard this noise in the garage. And I'm like, well, I don't know what he's doing, but he's in there doing something. And my place was in the basement, so I went downstairs. Like half hour later, it goes by, and I'm like, what the hell is that? So I ended up going upstairs and opened the door, and he was crying and trying to tie a noose around the rafters of the garage. And he had asked me to help him with taking his own life. And that was heartbreaking, to watch your hero just kind of devolve into a shell of the man you'd looked up to, or you look up to for that matter. So throughout those years, the couple years leading up to his passing, there was other events like that. There was times he developed a pretty severe alcohol use disorder, started drinking very heavily to cope with what was going on with him, but it only exacerbated the disease he was struggling with. So there was times where I came home from wherever I was on a weekend, and he didn't know who I was, and he would, like, I would walk in, and he thought I was an intruder, and multiple occasions I came and tried to attack me, thinking I was a complete guy just breaking into the house, and had to restrain him on a number of times and until it sunk in that I was his son. And kind of watching that devolve over the years is heartbreaking. But one day I remember it being a Sunday, and I was dating a girl at the time, and we were going to go out to brunch, or we went out for brunch with her and her family. And through that time, we'd kind of gotten into the habit, or at least I got in the habit of trying to tell him that I knew he was going to go sooner or later. You just don't know when it's going to happen. You know it's going to take his own life, and you don't know when it's going to happen. But through that, I got into the habit of knowing that this was kind of coming down the pike, that I got in the habit of telling him I loved him. And so that Sunday, I wasn't even thinking about it, and I was just thinking about going and meeting up with my girlfriend and her family, and I was just getting my shoes on and everything like that, and he came up to me and just gave me a big hug and told me he loved me. He told me he was going to be going out for the night. He hadn't been out of the house in weeks, so I'm like, yeah, go do your thing. But I was leaving for brunch. He came up and gave me a hug and told me he loved me, and gave him a hug back, told him I love you too, and went out to my car, backing out, and he was standing at the door. He was standing at the door and like just watching me go, and that was the last time I ever saw him. And I came home later on that evening, and he wasn't back. And I was just like, yeah, that's weird. He's not back, but whatever. Like, it didn't pique my kind of radar. It made me like concerned, but not to the point where I was going to go out looking for him or call or whatever. But I'm like, yeah, he'll probably be back in the morning. So I got up for school on the Monday, and went, checked him. Still wasn't home. So then I was like starting to really worry. So I went to school, and I was just like, okay, if he's not back when I get back, then you got to figure this out. And sure enough, got home from school, he still wasn't home, and I'm like, now I'm worried. So he had bars that he had frequented during that time, and so I called those places. And the third place I hit was this little pub he used to go to, and I found out that he had been there the night before, but that was all I found out from talking to them. Well, he had to sleep somewhere, so there was actually a hotel in that same parking lot where that pub was, and so I'm like, naturally, I'm gonna see if he stayed there. But I called over to the hotel, and they couldn't tell me if he had checked in, but they asked me if there's a reason why he'd want to harm himself, and my stomach dropped. It was just like right in a second, I knew the likely outcome was going to be the worst. And so I called my aunt and sister and just let her know what's going on. And they're like, wait till we get there. Well, like 45 minutes passed, and I'm like, fuck this. I'm not sitting around here anymore. Whatever. If you're not, whatever. I'm leaving. So I hustled over, and there's paramedics there who are my dad's friends, and who I'd known one of, I'd known one of them since I was a kid, and went over to the room, and he was just laying on the bed. And that was the hardest I think I'd ever cried in my life. This is without question the worst day of my life. And shortly thereafter, my aunt walked in and saw me just bawling my eyes out on that couch and in the lobby. Then I heard her let out this scream that I'll never forget. And that was it was terrible. After I stopped crying, I just felt void of emotion. After I got that cry out, it was almost just like I was upset, but I wasn't anymore. Like I was just void of emotion. So we went home and went back to my dad's place, my aunt, my uncle, and I, and we had to call my brother. My uncle called him. My brother was on his way up north somewhere for, he was going with a trip with the girl he was dating at the time, and he was just like, yeah, come home. And he was like, well, what's going on? He's like, just come home. And leading up to that moment, I was riding on a knife's edge of stress for years at that point. And I started getting into opioids because it was the only thing that actually made me feel level-headed and got that stress out of me for as long as that opioid was lasting. So it started out with Percocets. I started using that to just kind of just calm myself down so I could keep moving forward so the stress wouldn't take me down. And then that kind of spiraled and got worse and worse. I mean, your tolerance goes up with the more you use, the more you're going to need to get to that same point. So it started out with Percocets, and then it led up into oxys, which started doing 80 milligram oxys. And when he passed away, it was just like I went off the deep end. I didn't care. I didn't give a shit about anything. It was just, no, whatever. I don't care what anyone thinks about it. I'm going to just do this because this is the only thing that gives me some sense of peace. But it was like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg. And it just spiraled out of control after that.
Did you start using before your father passed away?
Yes, shortly before. Shortly before he passed away, I started using pills. I'd hid it from my girlfriend at the time and her family, it started there, and then it just got worse and worse and worse, and took a decade of my life.
Do you think there's any connection between when you were just using marijuana and like opioid drug use?
I never really thought of any degree of a link between the two, between cannabis and opioids. It wasn't. I never associated one with the other. It's just that happened to be my substance of choice, where it was the thing that made me feel normal. And it was the thing that helped me mask what the depression, the anxiety, the everything that came with watching my dad decline. It was just the one thing that hit like nothing else. So it was the only breath of fresh air I felt like I had during that time frame was when I was using.
What was your understanding of addiction before you had a problem yourself?
My understanding of addiction through that time was, I'd known what it was, but realistically, like I knew my dad was a smoker, so I mean, I knew what addiction was in general, but I didn't know anything about it when you got into the details of it, and it was very ironic actually. My dad, I remember I was just screaming at him one day because of his drinking, and because it got really out of hand, and I just completely snapped on him. And I remember this, it's one of my biggest regrets in my life, actually. I remember he told me, "You'll understand when you're older." And I told him he's and I can't imagine how that made him feel in that moment. Because now, having come full circle, it's now my profession is an addiction. It's just, you look back on it and you're just ashamed of it. Because you just stigmatize the person you love the most in the world. I mean, unbeknownst to me, I didn't know what that kind of effect would have, but it's one of the biggest regrets in my life. I'd felt that there was a bit of an issue initially when I started hiding it from people. But when it really sunk in was, I remember it as if it were yesterday. I had went over to a girl's house that I used to get pills through, and I remember like it had been like a day and change without having, and I remember getting the chills and hot flashes. And I'm like, yeah, no, I think I'm getting sick. And then she turned to me. She's like, "Oh, you're in withdrawal." And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" And then she's like, "Yeah, you're in opioid withdrawal." I'm like, "Oh, like what?" I didn't really know anything, but so it was. That was the very first time where I'm like, it sunk in that I'm like, you're now getting physically sick because you don't have it, and that's when I was started to notice there was an issue, but wasn't enough to make me stop because it was still masking that pain that I was going through at the time.
How did addiction affect your relationships?
Addiction destroyed my relationships with I wouldn't go. Nobody wanted to be around me. People would talk behind my back. I would get word of it. I came clean to the girl I was dating at the time, who I loved dearly at the time, actually, and she broke up with me, and that really hurt. That hurt so much because this was kind of really the only person I had to really lean on at that point in time in my life, and it kind of felt like I had nobody after that. And it with opioids, I mean, it ruins your home life. It ruins your sex drive. It ruins your relationships with friends, and the second you hear anything you don't want to hear, you'll snap in a heartbeat. So no one wants to be around you. And then when they are around you and you do have your pills, you're nodding off because you're so high. And then that pushes out more people. And then the irony of it is that with the nature of addiction is you'll always go to a place and use where you feel safe. And that's generally speaking in an isolated place. And where that you kind of strive to be there, but then when you're isolated, when you don't have the option of having your friends around, that's when the loneliness starts to kick in. And just nobody, I'd been written off by my friends, my family, and I mean, to this day, I can only count maybe a handful or two people who are there for me through it all. And I mean, the one lesson I learned through that was like, I don't know, get into a real jam and see who's still there, because it's generally speaking, maybe some of the people who you might anticipate be there will be there, but a lot of people you expected to will go. And in all honesty, I don't blame them for not wanting to be around me. I don't blame them in whatsoever. The treatment I got was pretty bad. Some of my family was we that was probably the most hurtful thing, was having some family members who wouldn't talk to me, and it was more off of hearsay than it was off of the reality of the situation. Which, don't get me wrong, I was in a dark place and I was in a bad place, and I was openly, I was using drugs and stuff like that. And I get where you want to distance yourself, but that hurt. It hurt a lot.
What was your lowest point throughout the experience?
Well, there's a few really low points. First being when I lost my dad's house. Yeah, that place meant the world to him, and I had squandered it because I had spent so much money on pills that I couldn't afford the property taxes. Mind you, I hadn't paid anything more than my cell phone and my car insurance prior to him passing. So when all the bills came down on me, I didn't know what I was doing. But when I lost that house, it was absolutely devastating. The lowest I think arguably I had ever been in my life was I was laying in bed one day. At the time, I was 139 pounds, stealing my food to eat. I was going years without gas in my home, so I had no hot water or heat. And I remember I was on day 4. I was laying in bed in the middle of the night on day 4 or 5, not knowing if the next day, like without food. And I was so hungry, and I didn't know if the next day was going to be any different. And I remember just laying there, just staring at my closet on my right-hand side, and just staring at my closet, just crying. I was so hungry. And that was just like, I had it. I'm like, I can't do this anymore. I can't do this anymore. Came up with a plan to take my own life. And I remember sitting there committing to that plan, or laying there committing to that plan, and then I had rolled over, and my dog, he was a Yorkshire Terrier, just small dog. I remember rolling over and just looking at him sleeping beside me, just watching his stomach go up and down as he was breathing. And I remember thinking to myself that I can't do that to him. I love that dog more than anything in the world. Like, that's the closest thing to having a child I've ever experienced, and a love that I've never had for anything else. And the idea of putting my dog, who had been my rock, the only thing in the world who didn't judge me or look down upon me for my decisions or what was going on with me, and to have him feel an ounce of what I felt when my dad passed away. It's like, no, I can't do that to him. He saved my life. And I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for that dog. But I actually have his name tattooed right here with his paw print on the back there. He had passed away years later after the incident, and yeah, I love that dog more than anything in the world. That was probably the lowest I'd ever been, and yeah, he saved me. I remember I didn't know anything about any kind of addiction services at the time, and the only thing I did know that I could have as a possible solution was going on methadone. And I went there because I just didn't know what else was there. So went in there and went in, and just very apprehensive. There was a stigma even amongst the users of when people are on methadone, ironically. And I went in there and started that program. I knew I had to do something. I'd actually tried to go down to my mom. I'd actually went down to my mom's in the States and tried to go cold turkey. My mom was a charge nurse in an emergency department, and her husband's a physician's assistant. So naturally, I thought they could help me. And it turned into, it didn't go well. And I've talked about it with my mom since, and I remember her saying to me, she's like, I deal with this stuff every single day, but it's different when it's your own. I didn't know what to do, and very, but I tried a couple times to turn it around, but when I started on methadone, that was kind of the starting of it, and then after the guy hucked the sign into my face, that's when I was really like, okay, I've had enough of this. I was working as a cashier at a department store, and particularly at the store, you take a lot of crap from people, and you complain enough, you'll get what you want. So it kind of attracts people who are going to complain a lot. So one day, a guy was coming through my line, and I was scanning all his groceries through, and then he had these 3 apples on the end, and I put it on the scale, punched in the numbers, and he's telling me there's a wrong price. I'm like, pull up the floor, like, no, bro, it's the right price. And he just grabbed his stuff and stormed off. I was like, whatever, go do your thing. Unbeknownst to me, he had went back to the produce department and grabbed a plastic sign that was with the apple bins, and came back. I had served a couple other people, and he came back and he frisbeed it square into my nose and cut my nose open to save 50 cents on 3 apples. And I properly fucking snapped on that. The only thing that stopped me from jumping that counter was that I knew I had 100 cameras on me. And that was probably the most irate I had ever been in a public setting in my entire life. But I went home after that. I quit my job that day because I knew I was going to get canned anyways after the tirade I went on. But I went home, and I remember staring at a wall unit for hours, like 2 hours, just me and my dog Chaz, and wondering like what was I going to do with myself now. When that guy threw that sign into my face, I remember going home, and I had had it. I was just so over just keeping my head above water, just ever so slightly, to be able to keep going. And I remember thinking to myself that I'm like, yeah, I can't go out like this. I can't go out as some cautionary tale to that I wanted more for my life. And then coming up with the idea to ride across Canada and film a documentary and everything, and film that documentary and raise awareness about this profound thing that has impacted my life so deeply, gave me the purpose to start pushing forward. And I had no experience in film, journalism, public speaking, public relations. I hadn't rode a bike in 8 years. I was on the highest dose of methadone you could be on before seeing a specialist. So I had to start somewhere. And I went into my doctor and said, like, listen, I got to start tapering. And I remember I tried before, but she knew I wasn't ready. But this time I went in and I'm like, yeah, let's start doing it. And she listened. And I had built a really good relationship with my methadone doctor. My first doctor I had, all I remember is the guy talking about the cottage he was rebuilding. Maybe 20% of the time was based on what was going on with me. But just by stupid chance, my work schedule changed and I got put over to another doctor who genuinely showed she had my best interest and that she genuinely cared about my well-being. And to have this, to be written off by everybody, and then have this one person that you are going to you can feel can help you actually demonstrate that they care about your well-being, built the trust for her and I to work as a team to start tapering. And I trusted her. To taper off methadone took me about 1.5 years, roughly. And through that, I noticed that was its own journey. Tapering off, so I taper from 120 down to roughly around 80, 85 milligrams. And then I started, because it's dropping by 5 mils every time. And then I'd start feeling the withdrawal after dropping the 5. I'm like, oh, no, this isn't lasting, but I don't want to go back up. So I found the healthy balance was I drop by 5, but I'd go back up 2 if it was really harming. So I'd still have that gain of 3 mils I was dropping. So it's still a mental win to me. So I just listened through my body all the way through. It took some time, but the time's going to pass me anyway, so I may as well do it moving my life forward. So tapering off was its own journey, and had the purpose where I tried getting off methadone a couple times prior to it, but it wasn't until I had this purpose that I knew what I wanted to do after I was off, which made turn this Mount Everest that I'd failed to conquer into a small step to something bigger. And that's where things really started turning around for me. So I had this purpose to do this role. I mean, it was all I thought about. It was my dream. And once I had that purpose was the thing that stopped me from falling back in, because I wanted this thing so bad and I wanted it more than I wanted anything else. And I was going to do it or die trying. It was what it was. And I mean, getting off of it wasn't a fraction of as difficult as it was the previous times, because I had this purpose and this goal in mind that excited me so much, and I got fired up that pulled me into that recovery. And so I ended up getting off methadone on January 27th of 2014. And I was going to the library through that time, and then started training in December, started eating again regularly in the November, and then sold my place in January, was on the road riding and filming of May. So I had this purpose as I was tapering. So once I actually got off, it was just transitioning into what I was doing, but I didn't have to go to a clinic anymore, which was ironically the last day because the day after you get off, you go to your doctor and you talk to them and just to make sure everything's okay and you're doing all right. And I remember the first day off in years and years. And I was waiting in line in front of the methadone clinic, and then this lady come back and called us junkies. And I remember I didn't react to it, but I remember looking at her and being like, "You're every reason why I'm going to go do this. And I'm going to show you that we're not write-offs to society. And you'll see." That was my thought to that at the time. But it just really cemented my purpose in what I was doing. The lessons, I mean, there are so many lessons that I've learned through my life of that addiction. One being that, like, say this is the aggregate of your life, and I don't care who you are or what you do, how successful you are or what it is, life is nothing but a series of peaks and valleys. And the more coping mechanisms that you develop over your time throughout your life, the less deep those valleys get as you move along it. And that can be the difference between saying, I don't know, I can't get through this, to let's just get on with it because I want to get on to something else, which are two very different places to be. One stems from a place of depression. One place it comes from a place of, yeah, let's just get on with it because I don't want to deal with this. And that being one. Two, but I mean, it was, nothing hit me overnight. It was just all a bunch of lessons that I had really been introspective about. And part of it all was, I mean, so I ended up getting on the road in May of 2014 with my ride. And I rode from Victoria, BC to St. John's, Newfoundland. And through that, I was meeting with people across Canada, meeting all these people who were open to sharing their experience within the opioid crisis, whether that be people in active addiction, to parents, to medical professionals, and tried to paint a picture of what was going on across Canada at the time. And through that, actually, I learned a lot about addiction. And I remember thinking at one point, I'm like, damn, if you want longevity in this, you're going to have to go back and address some stuff. So I actually didn't get into any kind of counseling or anything like that until after I had gotten off everything, did this bike ride across Canada. And then I'm like, okay, I got to go get some treatment. So, but the life lessons I learned came through a lot through interacting with the people I met across and putting context to what I had experienced. And I could go on for days, but I think the biggest lesson I learned through all of that was how to make my mental health work for me. So say, for instance, depression, that used to just be, that would bring me to, it still brings me to low places, but at this point in time in my life, I look at my mental health as tools. So with depression, there's never been a depression I didn't walk away from being better for having went through it. because it forced me to reorder my life so I could keep moving forward at a higher level, so I could keep moving forward. Anxiety teaches me how to think like a chess game. I'm 3, 4, 5 steps ahead, and I can map out potential negative outcomes so I know what to avoid moving forward. Addiction taught me if I want something bad enough, I'll find a way to get it. And then ADHD is something I was diagnosed with in my adulthood. It taught me I'm an interest-based learner. If I'm interested in what I'm doing, I could hyper-focus on it and pick it up actually quicker than a lot of people. Throw a math book in front of me though, I'm at lunch, but I can really hyper-focus on things and actually pick things up. Whereas for a chunk of my life, I felt I was a functioning moron because of it. And then lastly, the post-traumatic stress from the events leading up and to my father's passing. That's a little bit more tricky because sometimes words or a word someone uses in a sentence, a song that comes on the radio can throw you back to a place mentally, and it's like a flashback. And I've learned to manage it at this point, but I think that the silver lining in that is it keeps me grounded in where I come from and what I can go back to.
So what is your life like now?
Well, it's great, actually. I've been over the last 10 years. I've been in recovery now for 10 years, rolling up on 9.5 years. So in January will be my 10 years. And I went on to do a second bike ride across Canada. So my first one was Victoria, BC to St. John's, Newfoundland, and got to see the country in ways that most people don't get to see. I've got to do it twice at that. I've been very fortunate. So where that stemmed from, or where that kind of went, was having been the only person in Canada to physically go town to town, coast to coast. That opened up a lot of doors for me, and I got an invitation to go do a presentation for the Health Minister of Canada about what I found, and went up and did a all right job, I think, and got asked to kind of come on and do some consulting for her at the time, and then worked for subsequent 3 other health ministers beyond that. And now I do a lot of consulting within mental health addictions and the opioid crisis. So I'm on the board of directors of the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction, the policy committee of the Canadian Society of Addiction Medicine, the Ontario Health on their substance use disorder provincial advisory table, Ontario Health East on their mental health and addiction strategy and opioid strategy, or CAMH on their constituency council, and locally where I live, the Durham Region Opioid Task Force. And that's one component of things. Secondly, I'm a motivational speaker now. I've had the privilege of speaking in front of thousands of people around North America. I had a speech in front of 5,000 people in front of the White House, which is just crazy. It was just so surreal. It was just like one of those "how did I get here" moments. And now a filmmaker as well. So this series is stemming from all that experience. And I mean, I've been very lucky and blessed to go on and live a life that if you would have told me when I was laying there staring at that closet door crying that one day that this is where my life would be, I'd say, "You're full." Like, no, that's not possible. And now to kind of be on this other side, I'm happy to share this experience in order to help others get there as well.
What would you tell someone who is currently in addiction right now?
Well, through my experience, like reflecting on my own journey, I would say, like, listen, those were bumps in the road. Those were difficult experiences that helped me put me on the path to where I want to be, and overcoming those obstacles, I think, is a strength, not a detriment. And that experience has helped me become a better person and be able to approach life and the world with a more well-rounded view than I would be able to without them. And at this point, I wouldn't trade them for the world. But as far as what I would tell anybody who is in the same position I was, is there's always hope. And don't ever think you can don't ever get to a place where you think that you have to do this alone. And I mean, to the men specifically, kind of being a bit on the harder side of reaching out, it's just, you're not too big of a warrior where you're going to man your way through it all. And we all need help from time to time, and it's okay to ask for and reach out for that help.